On the morning of March 15th, 1921, a young Armenian man walked up to one of the architects of the Armenian genocide on a Berlin street and shot him dead. He was arrested immediately, tried in a German court, and acquitted. The man who pulled the trigger was Soghomon Tehlirian. He was 24 years old, a genocide survivor, and he had crossed 3 countries to find Mehmed Talaat Pasha, the former Ottoman interior minister who had personally ordered the deportations that killed more than 1 million Armenians between 1915 and 1916. Tehlirian had lost most of his family. He had watched the killing, he had survived it himself, half buried under bodies in a ravine near Erzincan, and crawled out alone. Talaat had fled Istanbul in November 1918, disguised in a German naval officer's uniform, aboard a German submarine. The Ottoman government that had carried out the genocide collapsed with the empire's surrender, and a handful of its architects faced military tribunals. Talaat was tried in absentia, convicted, and sentenced to death. But by then he was living comfortably in Berlin under an assumed name, protected by a network of German sympathizers who had been, not incidentally, Ottoman allies during the war. That protection wasn't incidental. Germany had been aware of the Armenian deportations as they happened. German military officers were embedded with Ottoman forces throughout 1915 and sent detailed reports back to Berlin. Ambassadors filed dispatches describing mass killings. The Imperial German government received this information, weighed it against the military alliance, and chose silence. After the war, that silence became shelter. Here's what makes this stranger still. The organization that tracked Talaat down wasn't a state. It had no legal authority, no diplomatic standing, no formal army. It was called Operation Nemesis, run out of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, a political organization operating in exile, coordinating from Boston. They built files, they mapped locations. They sent operatives into Europe to surveil former Ottoman officials, and when the targets were confirmed, they sent assassins. Tehlirian had been recruited into Nemesis after surviving the genocide, and his assignment was Talaat. He trailed him for weeks in Berlin, observing his routines, confirming his identity. On Hardenbergstrasse, on a Tuesday morning, he waited for Talaat to pass, stepped up behind him, and fired a single shot to the head. Then he stood there. He made no attempt to run. The trial opened in Berlin in June 1921 and lasted 2 days. What happened inside that courtroom was, by any conventional legal standard, extraordinary. The defense was not built on procedural technicality or mistaken identity. It was built on the genocide itself. Tehlirian's lawyers, including the prominent German attorney Adolf von Gordon, brought survivors to the stand. They entered documentation of the deportations. They made the Armenian extermination the subject of a German criminal proceeding at a time when no international tribunal had done so, and no government had formally prosecuted it. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Tehlirian had killed a man. There were witnesses. He had not fled. But the jury acquitted him unanimously after deliberating for just over an hour. The legal reasoning was never fully articulated. German law at the time did not recognize a formal defense of provocation that covered what Tehlirian had experienced, but the verdict was clear enough. A jury of 12 Germans, citizens of a country that had been Talaat's ally, looked at what Talaat had done and decided the killing was not a crime worth punishing. The implications of that verdict are uncomfortable in 2 directions at once. On one hand, it was an act of extraordinary moral recognition, a public acknowledgement, however informal, that what the Ottoman government did constituted something beyond the reach of ordinary legal categories. On the other hand, it was vigilante justice, conducted by a private organization outside any legal framework, ending in a killing on a public street. Both of these things are true. The discomfort of holding them together is exactly the point. One of the men who followed the Nemesis operation closely, and who would later build on the moral and legal questions it raised, was a young Polish-Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin. He was a student when the Tehlirian trial occurred, and he read everything he could find about it. The question it planted in him was specific. How could a man be tried for murder? He later wrote, when the state whose leader he had killed bore no legal responsibility for the murder of 1 million people. That asymmetry disturbed him for decades. It was one of the foundations on which he eventually built the concept of genocide as a crime under international law, the word he coined in 1944, the framework he spent the rest of his life trying to make binding. Talaat Pasha ordered a genocide. He was protected by allies who knew what he had done. He was hunted by survivors who had no other recourse. He was killed on a street in Berlin, and his killer was set free. And the lawyer who watched that verdict from a distance went on to write the legal architecture that would define mass atrocity for the rest of the 20th century, not because justice had been done, but because it so clearly had not been done through any mechanism civilization had yet built. The word genocide did not exist when Talaat gave his orders. Lemkin made sure it would exist for the next time. If this episode made you think differently, subscribe. New episodes every week. And if you want to go deeper, there's more waiting for you.